Welcome to another episode of Stories from the Edge of Life. Today we have once again a very special guest, Rachel Jones. Good morning, Rachel.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Would you mind introducing yourself to our audience, please?
Sure. So my name is Rachel Jones. My background is in journalism. I have a master's in journalism from Columbia University and worked in journalism for quite a long time. I'm the author of a book called Grief on the Front Lines, Reckoning with Trauma, Grief and Humanity in Modern Medicine, for which I interviewed around 150 healthcare workers all across the United States. And I'm currently a student at the Vancouver School of Theology, where I'm studying to become a hospice chaplain.
All right. And I'm Parag Bharadwaj. I'm a hospice and palliative medicine physician. So, uh, you've had a very interesting life. You started off as a journalist, right?
Mhm.
Uh, and I was reading a little bit about you. You've published in some very reputable publications. And tell us a little bit about your background as a journalist, uh, what areas you covered. I believe you've been covering regions, you know, apart from the US and North America. So just a brief background of you would be great for our audience.
Sure. So I think I started to become interested in journalism when I was in undergrad. I studied sociology at Lewis and Clark College in Portland. And for my thesis, I wrote about a comparative analysis of the genocides that had occurred in Rwanda and in Bosnia. And in that process, I kind of came to the conclusion that there was not enough action in Rwanda because of the lack of media coverage. And so I decided I wanted to become a journalist. So after some time, I went to Columbia University. I got a master's in journalism. And then I first went to report from Venezuela. And I was interested in Venezuela because Hugo Chavez was the president at the time. So there was a lot of news coming out of there, but I couldn't quite tell from what I was reading. Everything seemed very polarized. I couldn't quite tell what I thought about the situation or what was the truth of the situation because the left leaning publications were very pro Chavez and everything else was very critical of Chavez. So I went to Venezuela. I did some freelancing for a while. I worked at like a local English language newspaper to start. And then I got a job at the Associated Press and worked with them for a couple of years. But a lot of our coverage just focused on, and this is kind of just the way the news system is set up. It's not anyone's fault, but a lot of our coverage focused on what the people in power were saying and what their opponents were saying. And there's not a lot of room outside of that to cover other things. My focus at the time was on oil and business news. So I spent a lot of time going to press conferences and in every story, you'd always get quotes from a person or two on the street. But I just felt that the news was very distorted in part because Chavez would just say things like, I'm going to stop oil shipments to the United States that he couldn't actually follow through on because all the refineries that process, or the majority of refineries that process Venezuelan oil, are in the United States. So you'd end up reporting these headlines, and even though you put that information further in the story, you just realize you're really sending out this distorted message. And then people are making policy decisions based on that. They're making opinions, they're forming opinions about places like Venezuela that are so far away based on that. So I started to feel really bad about the kind of reporting I was doing. Um, at one point, the AP cut back on a lot of staff and I was laid off. And I started doing a lot more regular freelance work for different magazines and publications. But I felt, and I thought then I might have some more freedom, but I just the way the news system is set up, you're still required to report on what everyone else is reporting on. And so everything gets very kind of limited and you don't have a lot of freedom within that. So after some time, I decided to step away from journalism. I thought I was never going back. I was writing fiction, and I moved back to the United States to work at a more community-oriented place. So I worked at first at the YMCA in downtown Oakland, which I loved because it just brought together people from all different backgrounds and all different ages, and it was such a vibrant and health providing place. But then I slowly started to get back into journalism. I saw an opportunity to write for a end of life website and blog called Seven Ponds. And I was really interested in the topic because I've always had kind of an interest in hospice work. At one point, I applied to be a volunteer at a hospice. So I reached out to them and was really excited, and they ended up hiring me. And so I've been working for them for about 3 years. We just cover a bunch of news, whatever's coming out in terms of end of life, whatever's new. We do book reviews of books related to end of life. We review songs and write poetry. And then we also interview experts in the field and things along those lines, and write longer articles that are reported as well. So I wrote one article for them called um, New Rituals Lesson Code, the Trauma of Code Blue Deaths for Clinicians. And it was about how clinicians handle the trauma of code blues. And it got a pretty good response, and people were interested. And then an editor reached out from North Atlantic Books and asked me to write a book about it. So that's how this book, Grief on the Front Lines, came about. And that was my kind of my foray back into journalism. And it felt very different from the kind of journalism I'd done before, in that it was very much focused on the emotional aspects of people's experience. It was focused on the workers themselves rather than the people who already have the microphone. So it just felt much more aligned with my own values. So I really enjoyed writing that. And in the process, I interviewed several hospice chaplains. Well, not all, only hospice, some more hospital chaplains, and worked in other areas as well. And I was just so touched by the work that they did. And so that's kind of what led me to this path of exploring chaplaincy for myself.
What a journey. So when you're talking about your journalism career, two things that came really stuck with me was that you're looking for freedom and you wanted to chase the truth, right? And how true to those two particular values was you working as an author to write this book, because this book is also written for a publisher, right? You have a publisher involved. So uh, I'm not familiar with how that works.
Mm-hmm.
Was that experience any different from how you worked for a news entity?
Yeah, it was very different in the sense that they just asked me to write a book about the topic, and then I needed to submit a proposal. But I could come up with any kind of proposal that I wanted to. So the reason I structured the book the way that I did is that I wanted to, it's kind of in three sections. So the first section looks at the major problems in healthcare. The second looks at solutions that people have come up with that are working within the system. And then the third is about changes in end of life. And it just seemed like such a broad topic that I wanted to address it in the broadest way possible. And that's also why I chose to interview so many people, which is unusual for a book. Usually people will focus on the stories of a handful of people, or even one person. And so I was able to structure it however I wanted. So I came up with the proposal, they approved it, and then I had to write some sample chapters. But I was never told, I was never really even, I got some guidance in terms of helping the writing to flow better. But other than that, I never was told I could or couldn't do anything, or told that they wanted something different in terms of the reporting. So I felt that that was really a lot of freedom. There was a lot of freedom in that. And in terms of the truth, I think it was just speaking to as many people as possible within the time frame that I had was important for that, because you start hearing the same things over and over. And I also did a lot of research and read a lot of what was already out there. And the same issues keep cropping up over and over. And it just became very evident that I think, like any big system, that is the system itself that's the problem, and the people within it are just trying to work and survive and function within a system that is very is very problematic itself.
Got it. So since we're talking about the book, what can a reader expect to get out of it?
Right. So I think For clinicians specifically, they found that the first section can be rather challenging because it talks. This is what I've heard from readers, that the first section can be challenging because it talks about so many of the issues that they encounter in their own work. But that it also can be very validating, because I think a lot of the emotional aspects of the work are not discussed or not acknowledged, and there's something that everyone experiences and struggles with. So it helps to people to feel that they're not alone in their struggles. The second part that has solutions, I find that clinicians enjoy a lot more, because it's a lot more uplifting. There's people who are doing all kinds of creative things to address the issues of grief and trauma in the field. And then the final section on end of life, I think people just find interesting. I talk about how clinicians are affected working with MAID, and how different ways that people are approaching end of life with ritual and other methods to kind of ease the transition of both the patient and their own response to dealing with death on a daily basis.
Sorry, I think that's great. And where can one find your book?
Yeah, so it's available from most major booksellers. It's on Amazon. It's on from Powell's in Portland. If you go to my website, rachelevangelinjones.com, there's a list of all the places you can buy it, including Target and Walmart. And it's also an audiobook, so you can get it from Audible as well.
So has it been read by you when one buys the audiobook, or somebody else?
No, by somebody else. I did get
Okay,
reviews from 3 narrators, and the woman did a lovely job.
got it. Thank you. Uh, so coming back to you, so you got involved with end of life matters before you start working on the book, and now you're pursuing a career to become a hospice chaplain. When exactly did you make the decision? Was the decision made before you started working on the book, or after? And if so, what drove your decision?
Well, it was kind of interesting because my decision was kind of bookended by the book. So the first chaplain I spoke to was for the article, and his name is Joseph Perez. He was at the time the president of the Association of Professional Chaplains in the U.S. And he was just such a lovely man and so heartfelt, and I could just tell how much he cared about his work and how important it was. And at the end of our conversation, I told him, you make me want to be a chaplain. And he was very excited about that. He was like, oh, you should do it. Wonderful. But at first, I wasn't sure if that was just another, because I've interviewed so many interesting people. And I often feel like, oh, I want to do what you do. I want to be a biologist, or I want to, be a social worker helping people in this impoverished community. But in this instance, it kind of stayed with me throughout the reporting. And so the other chaplains I spoke to, there was one Muslim chaplain who was very inspiring. He had been in Ferguson when all of the conflict was happening there. And he said that he felt he wanted initially to join the police force because he wanted to create a more conscientious police force. And his wife, who was a physician, told him, no, come to my hospital, talk to our chaplain, and he can help you figure out what to do. And so he did that. And then he was inspired to become a chaplain himself, because he felt like that was the way to affect positive change. And so just all these people's stories are so inspiring. And then the last person that I interviewed for the book, he's the last person quoted in the book, wasn't quite sure that he wanted to be interviewed, because he didn't realize that with a journalist, you can't edit what is written about you. And so I was like, well, that's fine. We'll just take this half hour and chat if you want, and you can think about it. We can do the interview later if you feel comfortable. And so we did that, but he ended up just kind of giving me this unofficial career counseling session. And at that point, it just kind of felt inevitable that this is the direction I was going. I'd already been looking at programs and everything. And so at that point, that's where I was heading.
Great. So we have an international audience. Would you mind sharing with us what exactly does a chaplain do?
Sure. And so I'm in Vancouver, Canada at the moment, and we've I guess the language is kind of moving away from chaplain now into I think it was first spiritual care provider and now spiritual health provider. But basically, it's someone who provides spiritual care at the bedside of a patient or family members of a patient, sometimes to staff. So they basically walk with that person through whatever they're dealing with. Often they help them look back on their lives and find meaning in their lives. They might help them with difficult decisions about their care if they're trying to discern what their values are and what direction they want to go in. So they're basically just available for whatever questions or emotional difficulties a patient or family member might be facing. And they also often provide support to staff as well.
Yeah, and I also want to make the audience aware that it's non-denominational usually, right? And it's
Yes,
just
definitely.
providing spiritual care. Yeah.
Exactly. There's no denomination involved. I think that's why they're moving away from the word chaplain, is because it has connotations with Christianity. And so I think people often refuse spiritual care, assuming that it's Christian when it's not.
All right. So very inspiring. And tell us a little bit more about the book. From a medical point of view, because we'll talk about the impact it had on you personally in a follow-up interview.
Mhm.
But yeah, what are some of the common threads one can expect? I mean, from as much as you can share with us.
Sure. Yeah, so it really focuses on grief and trauma in the field. So it looks at how the system itself traumatizes people working in healthcare. So that can be a lack of time, difficult hours and scheduling. It can be a lack of time with patients, which came up a lot. For people in residency, it can be hazing or bullying, or just this culture that's been so ingrained in the system for so long that it's hard to change, even though people can see that it's not helpful. For nurses, it can be, having time to take a break or even eat lunch. A lot of people experience stress and anxiety and mental health issues as a result of this. I mean, many of us struggle with that regardless. So, working in these traumatic environments is almost more important to get mental health care, and that can be harder for clinicians who are afraid that it might affect their licensing. Even though that's often not the case, the fear is still there, and sometimes it is the case. Um, so there's been work around that to try to change the licensing board requirements to make them more compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then there's also like a wide range of interventions that people are doing that have been very effective. For example, Johns Hopkins has a peer support program called Resilience in Stressful Events, where people can page a peer to come speak with them after a adverse outcome. And it's confidential, it's usually within the same day. And those have been shown to be very helpful. Other people have found really creative and diverse things such as music or hula hooping or art therapy, not so much therapy, but working with other clinicians and creating art together as a way to kind of express what you've gone through. These are all things that people have been doing that have been found to be really helpful and have received a lot of interest. Um, and then in regards to end of life, I think it's just dealing with the fact that, as we all know, the aging baby boomers are coming and we're not really prepared for that. And so I think it's just helping people to come to terms with what that might mean and how the system might need to shift to better support its healthcare workers in order to make it sustainable for them and for the system as a whole.
Sorry, sounds like a very insightful book. I would request our audience to consider looking into it. I'm going to get it now, especially that you mentioned it comes in the audiobook version. It has an audiobook version. So, yeah. Um, I really want to thank you for shedding light on your career and your book. Um and I think sometimes we don't realize all the effort that goes into it, especially your book, you've mentioned the number of people you've interviewed and the insights you've had, and I think your personal drive in terms of what you were seeking and what you seek to publish is just fascinating to me. Uh, we hope to have you again to share your personal journey and share some of your personal insights as well.
Okay, wonderful, Parag. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you very much.